The boiler room at Hargrove Fabrication smelled like cutting oil and 30 years of other people's decisions. Not the kind of place you'd expect to find the most important person in the building. But that's where my office was. A converted storage closet off the main floor between the press brake and the coolant tank. I used to joke that they gave me the worst real estate in the building because they knew I'd never leave. I was right about that. And wrong about everything else. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I was 53 years old, I'd been with Hargrove for 22 years, and I knew that facility better than the fire marshal, the insurance adjuster, and the plant manager combined. I started on the floor running a lathe, worked my way up to process engineer, then senior process engineer, then what they eventually called Director of Manufacturing Operations, which was a title they invented because they didn't have a box for what I actually did. I designed the workflow systems. I wrote the maintenance protocols. I trained the people who trained the people currently running every machine on that floor. I also knew, and this is the part that matters, that the hydraulic calibration on line 3 needed manual oversight every 72 hours, or it would drift outside tolerance. Had been that way for 6 years. We'd submitted 3 capital requests to replace the unit, all 3 denied. So instead, we managed it. I managed it. It was in my maintenance log, my shift supervisor's checklist, and exactly nowhere else, because nobody above me had ever cared enough to read either document. I should have seen it coming. But when you've given 22 years to something, you stop looking for the exit signs. My boss's son-in-law started in January. I'll call him the new VP, because that's what his business card said, even though the only thing he'd VP'd before was his father-in-law's golf club membership. He came in wearing the kind of watch that costs more than my truck and spent his first week scheduling what he called alignment sessions, which were one-on-ones where he asked you questions he already had answers to. Mine was on a Thursday afternoon. He had a printed org chart on the table. My name was already grayed out. He didn't open with that. He opened with talk about organizational evolution and strategic reallocation of talent resources. I sat there and listened the way you listen to someone read the weather forecast in a city you're about to leave. When he got to the part about my role being restructured, I asked him directly who was going to oversee the Line 3 calibration cycle. He wrote something down. He nodded. He said the team was capable. I told him the cycle needed to run by Thursday of the following week. I told him it was documented in the maintenance log, and that the overnight supervisor, a good kid named Ray, knew the protocol but had never run it solo. I offered to walk Ray through it one more time before my last day. The new VP smiled and said he appreciated my commitment to a smooth transition. Then he handed me a separation agreement and pointed to the signature line. I signed it, took my thermos, my framed copy of the plant's first ISO certification, the one with my name in the acknowledgments, and my 22 years. Walked out to the parking lot. Sat in my truck for about 10 minutes watching the loading dock like I was waiting for something. Then I drove to Carver's, the bar about a mile down Route 9 that the floor guys had been using as a de facto union hall since before I started. Took my usual stool at the end of the bar where the television doesn't reach. Ordered a bourbon and a water back. Looked at my phone. My wife had already texted. How'd it go? I sent back a thumbs up emoji because I didn't have words yet. 3 guys from second shift were in the back booth. One of them, a press operator who'd worked for me for 11 years, came over and shook my hand without saying anything. That mattered more than most things that had happened to me that month. I finished my drink and drove home the long way, past the reservoir. The following Thursday, I was in my garage reorganizing my socket sets when my phone rang. It was Ray. His voice had that particular quality of a person who was trying to stay calm and not succeeding. Line 3 had flagged a tolerance deviation. The automated system had caught it, which was good, but the shutdown protocol had tripped wrong, and now they had a partial jam in the feed assembly with a customer order, a big one, aerospace components with a delivery window, due out the next morning. The new VP wasn't answering his phone. Ray had called 3 other people. He was calling me fourth. I asked him what the jam looked like. He described it. I asked him if anyone had pulled the manual release on the secondary feed. Silence. Then, there's a manual release? There is a manual release. There is a manual release. It's behind a panel that looks like a wall. I installed it in 2019 when we were having the same problem with the predecessor unit. I documented it in a maintenance supplement that apparently nobody had read. probably because it was filed under a folder labeled, and I will always regret this, Supplemental Feed Assembly Notes Reverend 4. I talked Ray through it over the phone. Took about 40 minutes. They got the jam cleared. They got the order out. Ray called back the next morning to thank me. I told him he did fine. I told him to read the Reverend 4 supplement. 2 hours later, my phone rang again. Different number. A woman identifying herself as an executive assistant asked if I could hold for the president of the company. The president of Hargrove Fabrication was my boss's father-in-law. He was in his mid-60s, built a company from a two-press shop in the 80s, and, this part is important, was currently facing a wrongful termination lawsuit filed by a former plant manager from the Dayton facility. That manager had been let go under circumstances very similar to mine. Same VP, same gray org chart I held. When the president came on, he was warm in the way that people are warm when they need something. He called what had happened a miscommunication. He mentioned my 2 decades of institutional knowledge. He used the phrase critical transition period 3 times. He asked if I'd be willing to come back in a consulting capacity while they brought someone new up to speed. I let him finish. Then I said I'd need to speak to my attorney before I responded to any proposal involving my former employer. Another silence. This one had a different texture. I had retained an attorney 2 days after my separation because my wife had insisted, and because the separation agreement had a clause that my attorney had flagged as potentially problematic under age discrimination statutes. We had been in a quiet holding pattern. The call from the president's office changed the geometry of that situation considerably. My attorney called me that afternoon. We talked for an hour. By the end of the call, I had declined the consulting offer in writing, and our response to the separation agreement was substantially revised. Here's the part I didn't expect. The Dayton manager's attorney reached out to mine the following week. Turns out they had been building a pattern of conduct case. Turns out my separation, with its grayed out org chart and its timestamp and its complete absence of any performance documentation, was exactly the kind of evidence that makes a pattern look like a pattern. I was deposed in March, sat across a conference table from the company's legal team and answered questions for 4 hours. I answered them carefully, accurately, and completely. I had saved every email. I had copies of every email. I had copies of every maintenance log. I had the 3 denied capital requests, each one with my signature and the date and the VP's signature approving the denial. The new VP was also deposed. I wasn't in the room for that, but I heard through my attorney that he was asked about the Line 3 calibration protocol. He apparently did not know there was a Line 3 calibration protocol. The case settled in August. I can't tell you the terms because of the confidentiality agreement that came with my portion of the settlement, which was separate from the primary case but not inconsiderable. What I can tell you is that my wife and I spent 2 weeks in Portugal in October, which we have been talking about doing for 11 years. The new VP left the company in June. I know this because Ray still texts me sometimes, usually with pictures of production numbers that are by Ray's assessment finally making sense again. The president retired in the fall. His choice according to the company newsletter that someone forwarded to me. Quiet, private. Not the kind of retirement announcement that gets a banquet. I want to be careful here because I know how these stories can sound. It's easy to shape them into something cleaner than they actually were. The wronged expert vindicated, the arrogant interloper punished, everything resolved at the right moment. Real life does sometimes hand you those moments, but the honest version is that there were months in the middle where I didn't know how this ended. Where I was driving to the hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon wondering if I'd made a mistake not taking the consulting offer. Not because I wanted to go back, but because the legal process is slow and expensive and uncertain, and some mornings it just weighs on you. My wife kept telling me to trust the process. She is, in most respects, smarter than I am. I'd worked at Hargrove since I was 31 years old. The smell of that boiler room is still in some of my older work shirts. I know what it feels like when Line 3 is running clean. There's a particular rhythm to it, a sound underneath the sound. I don't miss the politics. I don't miss the budget fights or the alignment sessions or the org charts with grayed out names, but I miss that sound sometimes. What I don't miss is having my worth defined by someone who couldn't find the manual release on the feed assembly he'd been responsible for 4 months. There is a specific kind of clarity that comes from watching someone confidently manage something they do not understand, and then watching the consequences arrive. It doesn't feel like victory exactly. It feels more like having been right about something you really wished you were wrong about. If I had advice for anyone who finds themselves handed a separation agreement at 53 with a grayed out name on an org chart, it's this: get an attorney before you sign anything. Save everything. Know what you know and document what you know, and don't let anyone convince you that your documentation is boring or redundant or unnecessary. The people who tell you it's unnecessary are the people who are counting on you not having it later. And if someone new comes in and asks what happens to line 3 on Thursday, tell them. Write it down, send the email, then let the clock run. I've thought a lot about what actually happened. Not the legal part, not the settlement, but the mechanics of how a thing like this unfolds. Because it didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen by luck, the new VP walked into that facility carrying a title and a watch, and a complete absence of curiosity about how anything actually worked. That's not unusual. What's unusual is how long organizations let that go on before the cost becomes impossible to ignore. In my case, it took 72 hours. In other cases I've seen, it takes years. The result is always the same. Someone who understood how the pieces fit together is gone, and someone who never bothered to learn is standing over a machine that doesn't work, wondering who to call. What I learned, and I mean really learned, not in the way you read it in a management book, is that the value of knowledge is invisible until it disappears. I spent 22 years building systems, writing protocols, training people, filing documentation under folder names that nobody ever opened. I thought that was just doing my job. What I didn't understand until I was sitting in my truck in that parking lot was that all of it was also a record of competence, of diligence, of someone showing up and doing the thing correctly when no one was watching and no one was going to reward them for it. That record didn't disappear when I signed the separation agreement. It was still in the maintenance logs. It was still in Ray's muscle memory. It was still in the 3 denied capital requests sitting in a filing cabinet with my signature on them. The new VP assumed that when I walked out, the knowledge walked out with me and was gone. He didn't understand that knowledge leaves evidence. It always does. I think about the integrity piece a lot, not in a self-congratulatory way. I made my share of mistakes over 22 years, and some of those maintenance logs have corrections in them because I got something wrong the first time and had to go back. But the habit of doing the work correctly, of writing things down, of telling the truth about what a system could and couldn't do, that habit is what made everything else possible. If I had cut corners, fudged the logs, told people what they wanted to hear about line 3's reliability, there would have been nothing to show an attorney. There would have been no deposition. There would have been no Portugal. The hardest months were the quiet ones in the middle, when nothing was moving and I didn't know how it ended. My wife kept telling me to trust what we'd built, the documentation, the case, the pattern of doing right by the work. She was right, not because the universe rewards good people on any reliable schedule, but because careful, honest work creates a paper trail. And paper trails, it turns out, are worth something in a conference room with attorneys on both sides of the table. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not sure I was ever really angry. More disappointed maybe, in the specific and exhausted way you get disappointed when something you worked hard to build gets handed to someone who doesn't know what it is. But that disappointment passed. What stayed is the clearer understanding of what I actually was. Someone who knew things, documented things, and didn't leave when things got hard. That's not a small thing. It took a long time to see it clearly. Now I do. Let the clock run. Do the work. Write it down. The rest tends to follow.